I still remember the exact moment everything changed. It was a Saturday evening in late October, one of those crisp nights in Ottawa where the air smells like wood smoke and dying leaves, and you think, for just a second, that everything is fine. My daughter was standing at the front of the banquet hall at the Château Laurier in the most beautiful ivory dress I had ever seen. She was glowing. She had worked so hard for this moment. Not just the wedding, but everything that led to it. 20 years of watching her stumble and get back up. And here she was, finally happy. Or so I thought. My name is not important. What matters is that I am a 63-year-old woman who spent 35 years as a registered nurse at the Ottawa General, raised 2 children, mostly on my own after my husband passed, and I have never, not once in my life, made a scene in public. That is not who I am. Or rather, that is not who I was. My daughter, Audrey, met her husband, Fletcher, 3 years before the wedding. She brought him home for Thanksgiving the first year they were together, and I remember thinking he was perfectly pleasant. Quiet. A bit too careful with his words, maybe, but I chalked that up to nerves. He was a project manager for a commercial construction firm in Canada, made decent money, seemed to treat my daughter well. His mother had passed when he was young. His father, a man named Gerald Whitmore, I had only met a handful of times before that October night. Gerald Whitmore. Even now, writing his name makes something tighten in my chest. He was a semi-retired property developer from Oakville, the kind of man who wore a sport coat to a casual dinner and still found the way to mention that it was Italian wool. The first time I met him, at a dinner Audrey organised at her apartment in Centurytown, he spent 40 minutes talking about a golf trip to Scotland and asked me exactly one question about myself. I told him I had just retired from nursing. He nodded once and then said, "Well, that must be a relief." As though 35 years of my life had been something I endured rather than chose. I let it go. I smiled. That is what you do. The second time I met him was at an engagement dinner at a restaurant in the Byward Market. He talked over Audrey twice and at one point referred to Fletcher's salary as modest, but he'll grow into it. Fletcher laughed it off. Audrey went quiet. I excused myself to the washroom and stood over the sink for 2 full minutes just breathing. But what happened at the wedding was different. What happened at the wedding was something I cannot explain even now without feeling the heat come up into my face. The reception had been going beautifully. The food was good, cedar plank salmon, roasted root vegetables, the kind of menu you'd expect at the Château Laurier. The speeches were done. The first dance was done. People were relaxed, happy, wine glasses half full, and then Gerald stood up. He hadn't been asked to give a second speech. The MC had not called on him. He simply stood up, picked up the microphone from the head table, I don't know how he even got it, and tapped the side of it until the room went quiet. "I just want to say a few words," he said. As the father of the groom, people smiled. Of course they did. What could go wrong? "Fletcher is my son," he said, "and I love him, but let's be honest." And here he paused, because Gerald Whitmore was a man who understood the weight of a pause. "This boy has never made a decision in his life that I'd call sharp. He's a decent enough fellow. Heart's in the right place. But sharp?" He chuckled. "His mother used to say he got her warmth and my stubbornness, and somehow ended up with neither the charm nor the brains." There was awkward laughter, the kind of laughter that people produce because they don't know what else to do with their faces. "Audrey, sweetheart," he said, turning to my daughter, "you are a lovely girl, and frankly, you could have done better. But here we are." He raised his glass. "To the happy couple." People raised their glasses because they didn't know what else to do. I looked at my daughter. Her smile had not moved. She had learned, somewhere along the way, how to hold a smile in place even when everything behind it was collapsing. I have never hated anything as much as I hated that skill she'd developed. Fletcher was staring at the tablecloth. I sat for exactly 45 seconds. I counted, and then I stood up. I want to be clear, I did not stand up in anger, or rather the anger was there, but it wasn't what moved me. What moved me was something colder than anger, something I had been carrying for 7 months. Let me explain. 4 months after Audrey and Fletcher got engaged, she called me on a Sunday afternoon and told me that Fletcher had been passed over for a promotion at work. It happened not long after he had clashed with his supervisor over the handling of a subcontractor on a job site in Nepean. The subcontractor had been hired through a procurement arrangement that Fletcher thought was irregular. He had flagged it internally and been brushed off. 3 weeks later, he was passed over for the senior project manager role he had been working toward for 2 years. Audrey told me this, the way she told me most things she was worried about, quickly and then immediately reassuring me that everything was fine. But I heard what she wasn't saying. Fletcher was demoralized. He had started second-guessing himself. And Audrey, bless her, was quietly terrified that the financial ground they had been building together was shifting. I didn't say much that Sunday. I made a note in my mind. Over the next several weeks, I did what I have always done when something bothers me. I looked into it quietly. I still have friends from my years at the hospital, people who have moved into administration, into legal, into various corners of the city. One of them, a woman I had worked with for 15 years, had a brother-in-law who was a commercial real estate lawyer. Over coffee one afternoon in January, I asked some general questions about how procurement in commercial construction worked in Ontario and what kinds of arrangements might raise regulatory flags. What I learned sent me home to my laptop for 2 long evenings. The subcontracting firm that had been brought onto Fletcher's job site was registered in Ontario, but had a beneficial ownership structure that led, through 2 numbered companies, back to a holding company based in Oakville. I am not a lawyer. I am a retired nurse. But I know how to read documents carefully, and I know when something does not add up. I took what I had found to a contact I trusted, a former patient of mine who had gone on to work for the Ontario Securities Commission, not in any official capacity for this matter, but as someone who could tell me, off the record, whether I was seeing something real or imagining it. He looked at what I brought him, and he was quiet for a long moment. And then he said, "Where did you get this?" I told him I had done the research myself. He was quiet again. And then he said, "I can't tell you anything official, but I can tell you that what you're describing is consistent with patterns that are already on certain people's radar." I asked him how serious. He said, "The kind of serious that moves slowly and then all at once." I went home and I sat with that for a long time. I thought about telling Audrey. I thought about telling Fletcher. I thought about going to a lawyer myself, or calling the relevant authorities. I turned it over and over in my mind through the spring and into the summer. And every time I came close to doing something with what I knew, I told myself, wait. Wait until you know more. Wait until you're sure. Don't blow up your daughter's engagement over something that might not lead anywhere. And then October came, and Gerald Whitmore picked up a microphone and called my son-in-law a fool in front of 200 people at the Château Laurier. So I stood up. I didn't rush. I walked to the head table, and Fletcher's father looked at me with an expression of mild amusement, the expression of a man who has never once considered that a woman in her 60s in a navy blue dress might be about to rearrange his world. The MC was standing off to one side with a look of pure helplessness. I held out my hand. He gave me the microphone. "Thank you," I said, and I waited for the room to settle. I'm Audrey's mother. Most of you know that, and I don't usually make speeches at events I didn't plan. There was a small, cautious laugh from a few tables. But I heard something tonight that I think deserves a response. I looked at Gerald. He was still smiling. He thought I was going to give a toast. He thought I was going to be gracious about it. "Gerald," I said, "you just told this room on your son's wedding night that he's not sharp, that he could have done better, that he got neither the charm nor the brains." I paused. I've been a nurse for 35 years. I've sat with people at the worst moments of their lives, and in all that time, I have never met a person less qualified to judge another person's intelligence than someone who's been building their own success on a foundation they think no one else can see. The room went very still. "I want to be transparent with everyone here," I said, "because I think transparency matters. Over the past several months, I've done a great deal of reading about a procurement arrangement on a job site in Nepean, about a subcontracting firm with a registration address in Mississauga and a beneficial ownership trail that leads back to Oakville, and about a pattern of conduct that, from what I understand, is already of interest to certain regulatory bodies in the province of Ontario. I did not use the word fraud. I did not have to. Gerald's smile was gone. I want to be clear, I said, keeping my voice level. I am not here to prosecute anyone. That is not my job. But I am here, as Audrey's mother, and as someone who has watched a good man be made to feel small for doing exactly what he was supposed to do, to say that the person in this room who should be embarrassed tonight is not Fletcher. I set the microphone down on the table. The silence lasted maybe 4 full seconds. And then, and I will never forget this as long as I live, it was Audrey's aunt, a 70-year-old retired schoolteacher from Kingston, who started to applaud. Slowly at first, and then a few others joined. I walked back to my seat. I did not look at Gerald again that evening. What happened next unfolded over weeks and months, not in one dramatic rush, and I think that is worth saying because life does not actually work the way it does in films. It moves at the speed of institutions and phone calls and lawyers reviewing documents. Fletcher came to see me 10 days after the wedding. He drove up from his and Audrey's place in Barhaven on a Tuesday evening and sat at my kitchen table with his hands around a mug of tea, and for a long time he didn't say anything. And then he said, "How long did you know?" I told him. All of it. The Sunday phone call, the coffee in January, the documents, the conversation with my contact. He listened without interrupting, which I'd come to understand was one of his best qualities. When I was finished, he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because," I said, "I wasn't sure it would go anywhere. And because I thought if I told you before the wedding, it would either fall apart or you'd spend your wedding day carrying something you didn't need to carry yet." He was quiet for a moment. "And at the reception, why then?" I thought about it. "Because he called you a fool in front of everyone who matters to you," I said. "And because I decided I was done waiting." He nodded slowly. "He didn't tell me I was right. But he didn't tell me I was right. But he didn't tell me I was wrong either." Gerald Whitmore retained a lawyer within 2 weeks of the wedding. That in itself told me something. By January, I had heard through a mutual contact, not my OSC friend, just someone who knew someone, that a formal review had been opened. I don't know the details. I'm not entitled to them. What I do know is that Fletcher's employer quietly reopened the internal review of the subcontracting arrangement on the Nepean site, and that the supervisor who had dismissed Fletcher's concerns was no longer with the company by February. Fletcher was offered the senior project manager position in March. Audrey called me when she found out. She was crying, the good kind, the kind that comes out sideways when relief finally gets permission to move through you. She didn't mention the wedding. She didn't mention Gerald. She just said, "Mom, he got it." I said, "I know, sweetheart." We were quiet together on the phone for a minute. And then she said, "You knew this would happen, didn't you?" I said, "I hoped." What I didn't tell her, what I have not told anyone, is that I sat in my car in the parking lot of the Château Laurier for a full 20 minutes after the reception ended that October night, not crying, just sitting, the radio off, the windows fogging slightly from the cold, wondering whether I had done the right thing, whether the right thing even existed in the clean way we pretend it does, or whether it was always just the least wrong thing available. I am still not entirely certain. Gerald and Fletcher have not spoken since the wedding. I don't know if they will. I do not think that is my business to fix, and I have learned, over 63 years, that there are some silences between fathers and sons that no one from the outside can enter without making things worse. What I know is this. My daughter laughs the way she used to laugh before she learned to hold her face still. Fletcher comes to Sunday dinner every few weeks and stays too late talking, which I've decided is the highest compliment a son-in-law can pay. And I have a photograph from the wedding, taken before any of it happened, when the evening was still just an evening, of the two of them at the head table, leaning slightly toward each other, the way people do when they forget anyone else is in the room. I keep it on the refrigerator, next to the grocery list. That is, I think exactly where it belongs. I have thought about that parking lot a lot since October, sitting in the car with the windows fogging and the radio off, asking myself whether what I did was right. And I think the honest answer is that I'm still not completely sure, and I've made peace with that uncertainty, because I think anyone who is completely sure they did the right thing probably wasn't paying close enough attention. What I do know is this: the things that happened afterward were not accidents. They were the result of choices, Fletcher's choices, and mine. Gerald spent years building something on a foundation he thought was invisible. He was careful and confident, and he underestimated the people around him, which is perhaps the most expensive mistake a person can make. Not because the universe corrects for arrogance in any tidy, poetic way. It doesn't, and I don't believe in that kind of accounting, but because when you consistently treat people as though they cannot see clearly, you stop watching what they're actually doing. And people, it turns out, see a great deal. Fletcher saw it on the job site in Nepean. He didn't have the language for it yet, or the evidence, but something in him recognized that what he was looking at didn't add up. And instead of letting it go, which would have been easier, and which the people around him were clearly hoping he would do, he said something. He filed the internal report that went nowhere. He pushed back against his supervisor. He got passed over for the promotion he had earned. And still, he did not decide that the right thing to do was the wrong thing to have done. That kind of steadiness is rarer than people acknowledge. It costs something real. I watched it cost him months of self-doubt and quiet discouragement, and he carried it without making Audrey carry it too, which told me more about his character than anything else could have. I did what I did because I had information that mattered, and I had been sitting on it long enough. I am not proud of the timing. I think there is a reasonable argument, and several people in that banquet hall were making it, quietly, with their eyes, that a wedding reception is not the place. I heard that argument. I understood it, and I still stood up, because Gerald Whitmore had just handed a microphone and an audience to his own worst instincts, and I decided I was not going to smile through it one more time. What I learned, or maybe what I was reminded of, is that clarity takes work, real clarity, the kind that lets you walk into a difficult situation and say something true without flinching, doesn't come from being confident or from being angry. It comes from having done the reading, from asking the uncomfortable questions before you need to, from being the kind of person who looks at something that feels wrong and thinks, let me understand this better, rather than, that's not my problem. I spent 7 months building that clarity, and when the moment came, it was there. Audrey laughs differently now. That is the detail I keep coming back to. Not the regulatory review, not the promotion, not any of it. Just the way she laughs now, open and unguarded. The way she used to before she learned to manage her face in rooms where someone might use her expression against her. I did not know until it came back how much I had missed it. I kept the photograph on the refrigerator. I still do. Some things, I think, are worth the cost of the parking lot.